Well, good morning. How you guys feeling? Woo, all right, not to disparage the first service, but you guys are already setting the bar pretty high here. Hey, one more thing real quick. Let's welcome all of our Bridgepoint family watching online today. Let's give it up. Man, I'm so excited today for really two big reasons. The first one is today is day one of 21 days of prayer. It's one of my favorite things we do here at Bridgepoint. If you're new or kind of checking Bridgepoint out for the first time, 21 days of prayer is something we do at the beginning of each school semester. So we do it in August and again in January. And we really just try to take the first 3 weeks of school to reorient ourselves and spend time with Jesus. And so what that looks like, practically speaking, is that Monday through Friday at 6 a.m. and on Saturdays, we sleep in till 10. We get here at 10. We have prayer services right here in the auditorium. Now, if you're like me, you hear prayer service and you think that sounds like the most boring thing I could possibly do. Why would you do that at 6 a.m.? Well, we really should come up with a different name, because what it actually is, we all come in together. We have a couple of songs of worship. There's a 5 to 7 minute devotional. Then we have about 25 to 30 minutes where we each get to spend time with Jesus in prayer. You think, man, that sounds like a long time to pray. And I promise you, it goes quick, because we have prayer guides that walk you through different things you can pray for. People submit prayer cards, so you can be praying for other people right here at our church. We even have a list of different prayer focuses that we have each day of the week. And so, man, if you come, that 25 minutes goes just like that. And then we end our time together with worship and a guided prayer at the end. And you leave each morning just feeling like you started your day with Jesus, and it changes everything. And so I would encourage you guys, if you've never been a part of it, come tomorrow, just one day. I know 6 a.m. is early, but just give it one day, and I promise it'll make a difference. Like, there are stories of life change here at Bridgepoint because people came to 21 days of prayer, and it set them on a completely different trajectory in their life. In fact, I love it because we first started this 4 years ago. There was like 2 or 3 of us up here at 6 a.m. And then this last semester, back in August, we had like 30 people every morning. We have 15 to 20 middle and high school students, right? You know God's up to something if middle and high school students are praying at 6 a.m. And so, man, if they can be here, we can all be here for that. So I'd love to see you guys tomorrow morning at 6 a.m. right here in the auditorium. Now, the other reason I'm excited is because today we are kicking off a series that we've been planning since the summertime. Like I've been fired up and ready to go. And if you've been around Bridgepoint long enough, you know, I'm not super creative with our sermon series titles. Like, if any of them are good, it's because somebody else named them. So I came up with the name of this one. It is what it is. The series is called How We Change, right? I'm just going to tell you what we're going to talk about. And I think it's so important because I think this topic of change is something that's always on our minds. You know, a lot of times change gets a bad rap. And you say, well, I hate change. And there are some bad changes. Like, you go to your favorite restaurant, they've taken something off the menu. Like, I'm still bitter that Taco Bell took the double-decker taco off the menu. You know, they still have the ingredients, right? It's the cheese is there, the tortilla. Like, why are you doing that to me? And to make matters worse, you know, it's all the same, right? My wife always says, every Mexican food is just a different form of a taco. Nachos, open-faced taco. Burrito, rolled-up taco. Chimichanga is just a rolled-up taco that they fried, right? It's all the same stuff. Why can't we have the double-decker? Just fired up about that this morning. I don't know. There is some change that is frustrating, that is bad, but the reality is, I think all of us have a longing for change in our life. I don't know, maybe I'm just different, but I doubt many of us are sitting here today thinking, no, I got this whole thing figured out. You know, I've got, like we want to experience change. And it's never more evident than when we get to this time of year in January, because whether you have resolutions or goals or whatever it is, we all have these aspects of life we want to change. Maybe you're in week 2 now and you're like, all right, we're still on track with the budget. Or maybe you made it your goal to read 100 books and you're already 20 in. Or maybe you're like a lot of people. My friend John and I, we work out together every morning, and we have this gym we love because nobody else goes to it. Like, honestly, they might have to shut the doors one day. I don't know, because we go in, no one's ever using the machines, we never have to wait. So it's getting to the end of December, and we're like, oh, well, it's going to be rough for the first 2 weeks in January, right? Everybody's going to show up. But if you can make it through the first 2 weeks, everybody falls off the wagon. Because what's going to happen? You go, well, we got the national championship game. We're late on Monday. Can't wake up early, and kids have stuff going on. We got prayer we're going to be up early for. And so you have all this stuff. Life kind of gets in the way. And so we revert back to the old way of doing things. See, the problem is not that I don't have to do a series called Why We Should Change. We want to change. The problem is we just don't know how to do it. Now, if you're a follower of Jesus, I think this idea of change is actually a good thing. There's been a movement recently that kind of pushes back against change and says, you don't need to change anything. You're perfect just the way you are. And there's a part of that is true. But at the same time, if you follow Jesus, that this longing for change in our hearts is something that was put there by God. In fact, I love what the early Christian leader Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 18. He says, we all, with unveiled faces, are looking as in a mirror at the glory of the Lord and are being transformed. Everybody say transformed. Into the same image from glory to glory. This is from the Lord who is the Spirit. So Paul is writing to some of the very first followers of Jesus who are living in the town of Corinth, and he's kind of encouraging them, and he uses this metaphor of a story from the Old Testament. See, the Old Testament tells us that Moses went up on a mountain to meet with God. And while he's meeting with him, he says, God, I want to see you in all your glory. Would you reveal yourself to me? And God said, if I did that, it would be so overwhelming, like you would die. So I can't fully unveil myself to you. So why don't you go hide behind this rock? And then my spirit will pass by and you can catch a glimpse out of the side of your eye. So that's exactly what happens. And Moses is just so excited. He goes down off the mountain to be with God's people, and they're all freaked out. They say, Moses, what happened up there? It's like, well, I got to glimpse God's glory. They're like, okay, but you're glowing. Okay, we're not talking like pregnancy glow. We're talking like his skin is literally glowing. And this happened every time he met with God. So to prevent people from freaking out, he put a veil over his face. I mean, think about it. When you're in the presence of God, something changes in you. And here Paul says, guys, not only that, but guess what? Now with unveiled faces, we get to glimpse the glory of God as revealed in Jesus. And now we're being transformed to look more like him. And that's what the Holy Spirit wants. He wants us to be transformed. Paul wrote this in Greek, and the word transformed there is the word metanoia, which actually is where we get our word metamorphosis. So a metamorphosis is like changing from one thing into something completely different. Anybody here ever seen the movie A Bug's Life? A few? Okay, because if you haven't, this illustration is not going to mean anything to you. But in the movie, one of the characters is a big old caterpillar, and he's kind of silly. And at the end of the movie, he goes into his cocoon, and you're kind of getting sad. You're like, oh man, this is my friend. Like, we've connected over the last hour and a half. And he comes out of his cocoon, and he's the same caterpillar, but he's got two little wings on the back. And we kind of laugh at that because that's not true metamorphosis, is it? Because when you go through a process of metamorphosis, you transform completely from one thing to something else. Right? Like actually in a cocoon, the caterpillar's body liquefies and it reforms into a butterfly. Paul here says that's what Jesus wants to do in your life. It's not about behavior modification. It's not like, oh, I met Jesus and now I don't cuss as much. Or now I don't look at pornography on the computer as much. Or now I don't gossip as much. It's not about behavior modification. He wants to transform you from one thing into something completely different. And I love the word transformation because it's this idea that, guess what? We're all being formed into something. Right? Like we're being formed by the world to look one way, but Jesus wants to transform us. There has to be a counter-formation into something completely different. So the question is, how can we experience that transformation? For a few minutes, I want to talk a little bit of psychology for you. And I don't say this as someone who's like an expert in psychology. I'm just leaning into people who are experts and who have written extensively on this because there's different theories of how people change. In fact, this is like a hot topic because, every company wants to know, how can we get people to change? How can we get people to buy more stuff from us? In fact, that's the whole idea behind social media and social networks, because we actually think that we're the consumer of social media when we're actually the product. Because you get on there and you scroll and they learn about your behavior and then they sell your data to other companies and that's how they advertise to you. So, you ever I don't know, you're talking to your kids about Curious George, and the next thing you know, you're getting Instagram ads for Curious George. Or you're like, hey, we should take a trip to the Bahamas. And then every ad on Facebook is a trip to the Bahamas. It's because you are the product. People want to change you. So how does change take place? There's a couple competing theories, but one of the most popular and grounded in studies and what a lot of people defer to is a theory of change called social cognitive theory. And you don't need to know all that, but it kind of comes from some experiments that were done back by a psychologist at Stanford University in the 1960s. And how they kind of approached these experiments is they took 3 groups of kids and they put them each in a different room. And then they played a video of an adult attacking Bobo the Clown. You think, well, what is Bobo the Clown? Anybody remember Weeble Wobbles? Okay, these are like the big inflatable things. They're heavy at the bottom, and so you punch them and they fall down, but then they pop back up. Okay, so they have a video where these kids are watching this adult punching, hitting, kicking, attacking this clown. So one group, that's all they see. The second group of kids see that video, but at the end, another adult comes in and praises the attacking adult and says, good job, way to hit that clown. Nobody likes clowns. Just punch him in the face again. And then the third group of kids watches that same video, but it has a different ending. This time, an adult comes in and scolds and reprimands the adult and says, that's not how we behave. We should never treat Bobo that way, and gets onto him. So after each of these kids watches this video, they take them into another room where they find Bobo the Clown. And what you can imagine is in the first 2 groups, they went in and they had just seen this adult do this. They'd seen the adult do it and get praised, so they go to town. I mean, they're taking mallets and hitting this clown. I mean, they're just having a good old time. Now, the last group that saw the adult get scolded, they went in and they were much more hesitant to hit the clown. But when an adult came in the room and said, I want you to hit the clown, almost all of them did it. Now you think, well, why is this a big deal? Because what it shows is that we are all conditioned to do things by forces we don't even recognize. Because even though these kids knew, hey, I saw this adult attack this clown and I know it's wrong, but when an authority figure comes in and tells you to do the same, you're willing to do it because you've already been conditioned to see that that's okay. This is why kids who are victims of abuse, oftentimes themselves grow up to be abusers. Because we're influenced, we're conditioned. It has ramifications then for how do we consume media. Because if you're playing video games and you're watching violent TV shows, it doesn't necessarily make you a more violent person, but you are more susceptible to be influenced towards violence if that's the kinds of things that you're consuming. In fact, they did this study again, but instead of an actual adult hitting Bobo, it was just a cartoon, and it had the same exact effects. So this idea that we're being conditioned by all these outside forces. So what are these things that form us and shape us into who we are? Well, social cognitive theory says it breaks it down kind of into 3 different things, and I'm going to use more common language than what they would use, but I mean, you can do research on this yourself. It's available on the internet. There's books about it. But the first thing that social cognitive theory says that we're influenced by is our beliefs. Okay, these are things that we're taught, that we come across, just what we believe shapes in some way the person that we are. But it's not just beliefs, it's also behavior, how we behave. And actually, behaviors kind of reinforce those beliefs, and it is kind of this cycle. But then the last segment is it's also where you belong. Like the people around you, the environment you find yourself in. All 3 of these things play a part in not only influencing you, but in influencing each other. So this is how people are formed. Okay, now here's the good news. You are being formed. Here's the bad news. You are being formed, whether you realize it or not. And there's 2 approaches to how you want to become formed, especially if you're a follower of Jesus. How do you want to be formed spiritually? You could either be, very intentional and you're like, hey, I've got all these things in place. Or I think maybe many of us, we kind of just allow life to happen to us. It's maybe not as diligent in the things that we surround ourselves with, the media we're consuming, all of this stuff. So you have intentional formation, and then you have unintentional formation. And so I kind of want to walk through each of those paradigms and show how this relates to how we live our lives. Are you guys still tracking with me? All right, okay. When we talk about unintentional spiritual formation, of course we want to start with the belief section, but how do we get those beliefs? oftentimes what it boils down to is these are stories we believe. They're stories we believe about ourselves, about our world. I mean, these things are shaped by media networks. I mean, I thought it was fascinating during the last presidential election. No matter which news channel you turned to, it was a completely different story they were covering. And even if it was covering the same story, it's always from a different slant and angle, because guess what? There's a story about the world that media companies want you to believe. It's not only like things that we consume. I think it's so funny. YouTube has this algorithm that I believe you're 6 clicks away from a conspiracy theory at any time. You can get on to look at Paw Patrol videos, and 6 clicks later, you're watching a video about how Adolf Hitler was a shape-shifting lizard. I mean, it's just, even social media can influence the stories we believe about ourselves. But it's not just that. It's even things that happen to us. Like you go through a very difficult breakup or a divorce, and you start to believe that you're unlovable and that no one ever really wants to be with you. Or maybe you grew up in a household where your parents weren't bad parents, but maybe they only praised you for the good things that you did. And so now you believe that you're only as valuable as the successes you have in life. And so that shapes who you believe. I can only be successful when you try to put on this front that everything is great. Or maybe you had a business that didn't quite make it. And so now you feel like maybe I am a failure. Like all of these things can happen to us and shape the stories that we believe about ourselves and about our world. Then out of those stories, we form behaviors that we'll call unintentionally they're habits that we have developed. And these habits really are things we use to cope with the stories we believe. So maybe you believe that you have to be successful, and so you're working hard, and you come home at night and you're stressed to the max. So what do? You head to the pantry and you eat. Because when you eat, everything is better. And I'll tell you, I'm not a stress eater, but I'm a bored eater. And if I'm bored, I'm just like, hey, food is fun, right? And I'll go into the pantry. It's just like, I'm eating like fruit snacks I haven't eaten since I was 10 because that's what the boys got this week at the grocery store. We have all these kind of habits. Or we feel unlovable. So we think, you know what? I'm just never going to let anybody close. And by the way, you can start to see a cycle how these reinforce. They become self-fulfilling prophecies, the stories we believe. I believe I'm unlovable, so I don't let anybody close. So then I believe I'm unlovable, and I keep pushing people further and further away. And so we develop all of these habits. And by the way, these are so ingrained in us, like it takes years to work through this stuff. I can't tell you how many times people want to come to me for counseling in their marriage, and they're 15, 20, 30 years into a marriage, and they think one counseling session is going to fix everything. No, they've had habits and patterns ingrained for decades that reinforce all of these stories. So you can see it's not one or the other. It's these are combined together. And of course, then you throw in that belonging aspect. These are kind of circumstantial relationships is how I talk about it. Because oftentimes, think about the people that you are friends with. You know, maybe for you, it's the people in your neighborhood. Maybe it's the other parents who are on the same kid's sports team. Maybe it's the people that you work with. And there are kind of these circumstantial relationships that we have, which is kind of crazy to think. Like we always tell our kids, like you become the people that you spend time with. So for our kids, if you spend time with kids, like listen, we all have these circumstantial relationships. If you are hanging out with the kids in your class who are disrespectful of authority, who don't care about their academics, who aren't using good language, then guess what you're going to become? Someone who doesn't care about your academics, who's disrespectful to authority, you know, all those same things. And we tell our kids that, but then how often do we're friends with someone because we happen to share a dorm room with them freshman year? Or because our kids happen to be on the same team, or they happen to buy the house 2 doors down. Now, that does not mean that those are inherently bad relationships, but it's just unintentional. Whoever we happen to be around, that's our friend group, and those people kind of reinforce who we become. And all of this happens in whatever environment we find ourselves in. So we all have a specific environment, right? Like suburbs versus urban versus rural. You have upper class, middle class, lower class. Like we have all these different environments. And here's a great example of how this impacts us. I remember during the 2012 election, some of my friends were like, I think Mitt Romney's going to win in a landslide because nobody I know is voting for Barack Obama. Because you have this environment where people tend to get in like-minded people groups. By the way, that's why it's so important for the church to be diverse, because we don't want to just be around this one singular environment. And so they were so shocked when it wasn't Romney who won, it was the complete opposite, because our environment shapes who we are. Does this make sense? So that's unintentional formation. And I think the scary thing is that I will put myself in here. Too often, this is how we allow ourselves to be formed. But Jesus doesn't want us to be formed. He wants us to be transformed. He wants us to look more like Jesus, not just a person who gives more, goes to church more. Like, we want to actually look like Jesus. So that's going to require intentional spiritual formation. So what does that look like? Well, instead of stories that we believe to be true, we have to rely on teaching that we know is true. And as people who follow, I'm not talking about my teaching. I'm talking about the teachings of Jesus. And it's fascinating because when you look at Jesus' teaching, it's not a bunch of like random moral guidelines he's trying to give. Jesus is trying to teach us what the world is supposed to look like. Like, you are supposed to forgive your enemies. You're supposed to turn the other cheek. That is what is true. Now, the world tells us if you do those things, you're going to be taken advantage of. But no. Jesus says this is what it like. He's trying to get us to engage our imaginations of what the world could be. I think there's such a stark contrast between how Christians wrestle with this. Because there was a political leader just a couple weeks ago giving an address to a group of Christians. And the words that he said were, hey, I know Jesus said we should turn the whole turn the other cheek thing, but that hasn't really worked out well for Christianity, so I think maybe we shouldn't take that as serious. I mean, it's like, okay, that person has chosen to believe the story that we have to like stand up for ourselves and defend ourselves over the teaching of Jesus and literally say, hey, we tried to follow Jesus, but that hasn't worked. No, we have to ground ourselves in teaching. By the way, that means there's some things that Jesus teaches that I don't want to do. There's some things that make me uncomfortable. But obedience only counts when I disagree. Like, if I tell my kids to do something and they were going to do it anyway, okay, fine. But when I tell them to clean their room and they don't want to do it, that's when real obedience kicks in. We have to ground ourselves in the teaching of Jesus. But then we also have to engage in these practices, all right? These are not just habits, but intentional practices that we have formed in our lives. These are these behaviors where we really just try to do the things Jesus did. Because teaching isn't enough, right? Like, listen, I preached some pretty good sermons in my life, but it hadn't even changed me, Like, teaching is not enough. Like, if knowledge was enough, then we could just read a book and everything would be okay. We actually have to have some behaviors. I was reminded of this week because one thing I struggle with in my life is like my digital consumption. Like, how much am I on my phone and on Netflix and on my computer? I don't mean I struggle with like, I don't know if I do it too much. Like, I know I do it too much. I'm trying to get that under control. So there was a book recommended to me called Digital Minimalism. And so I go ahead and I buy this book. But the way I bought it is like for Christmas, my mother-in-law gave me the brand new Kindle Paperwhite. And I love this because I love a physical book. Like, studies have shown you remember more. Like, that's why I have my physical Bible here. But there's something to be said, like, I can buy a book and it's immediately on my Kindle. And then you can like make notes. So if I'm sermon prepping at the end, I can just click the notes and see all the stuff I've highlighted. It's just like very convenient. And so I'm reading this book and it's like rocking my world. And then I have a moment of clarity where I'm like, wait a second. I'm reading this book that I bought on my phone that's now on my Kindle while I'm sitting next to my open computer, and it's telling me how I should use technology less. Like, if I could know enough into behavior change, I would have done it. But I actually need to put these practices together. And the practices we're talking about are not these random things. Like, it's not these latest fads and trends. We're just trying to do the things Jesus did. Like, if you want to look like Jesus, you got to do the things he did. And not just talking about forgiving people. I'm like, Jesus took time for silence and solitude. Like, he got away from everybody. In fact, I was challenged with this week. Like, when you read the scriptures, does Jesus seem like a person who's always in a hurry? Like, he seems like he's on a mission, and there's some urgency. But I mean, we're talking about the Jesus who, like, he's on his way to heal somebody, and a woman reaches her hand out to touch him, and she's healed, and so that they stop and have a conversation. Like, Jesus wasn't like, hey, I don't have time for you, I'm already busy. Jesus is the one who, instead of rushing through the region of Samaria to get where he was going, he stops in the middle of the day at a well and ends up having a conversation with a woman whose life had spiraled out of control. Jesus doesn't strike me as the kind of person that I've become, where he would sit down at a meeting at 10 a.m. and said, hey, so excited for this. Just to let you know, I have another meeting at 11, so we got to keep it on time. Like, I wonder if I looked at Jesus's iCal, like how much would he have blocked off? Or how much would he have just an unhurried, unrushed, he has these rhythms of silence and solitude. Like, I think, man, I'm busier than Jesus was, and I'm accomplishing a whole lot less. So something's got to change. You know, Jesus took time to pray. Jesus knew his scriptures. Jesus went to the synagogue and worshiped. Jesus sat down and shared meals with friends. Right? These are practices that we have to incorporate in our life. It's not just learning about Jesus. I wish that was enough to change, because I've learned a lot about Jesus. But we have to have these practices in our daily routine. And then we have to combine that with the third step of not just conditional relationships, but like real community, like intentional community. That's why we are so big on life groups here at Bridgepoint. Like, we have our small group season is going to kick off in just a few weeks. And the reason that we make such a big deal about it is not because I get a bonus if a bunch of you sign up for groups. It's not because, Julie, our connections director, doesn't have anything better to do, so we had to give her some busy work. No, like, life change happens in community. We need people around us. That's why you stopped going to the gym 2 days ago, because you didn't have a partner who called you and said, hey, I'm waiting on you. Get out of bed and join me. Like, we need people to help us with these practices, who need to challenge the stories we believe. And I'll just tell you, tomorrow is the deadline. If you're thinking about leading a group, tomorrow's the deadline. Like, go ahead, go on our website, register your group. You think, well, I don't know if I have what it takes. Listen, that's a beautiful thing about community. We've always said the curriculum is the excuse just to get in relationship with people. Like, if you're going to be on a softball team, turn it into a group, because then you get community who's going to help you with these things. You love to knit, start a knitting group and just get around people who are going to help you do these things. You want to cook? Invite me over for dinner. And then start a cooking group where you want to study the Bible. That's great. Like, I want to do this Bible study this time. Like, get people around you. But it's the relationships that are more important than the curriculum. We live in a day, there's a verse in the New Testament that says you have thousands of spiritual teachers, but you don't have many spiritual fathers. It's like, man, you can get great biblical teaching, but what you need people to invest in your life. So if you're on the fence about leading a group, here's the word from God today. Do it. Right? Register the group. It's so important. I love how we have more people, consistently more people in groups than we'll have on a Sunday morning. This is what it looks like for change to happen. And of course, all of this only happens through the Holy Spirit. Like, please don't mistake what I am saying is that you need to white knuckle this, right? Like you just need to do it all on your own. No. We need the Holy Spirit to produce fruit in our lives. In fact, we think about, like, as a church, how are we helping people with this? And I'm not trying to rag on churches, but I think when we look at this paradigm right here, a lot of church effort and energy is spent on the teaching part, right? Like, people want to go where there's good teaching and man, we want to listen to all these podcasts and all these YouTube videos and all that stuff. Listen, all of that is great, but it's only one aspect. And real life change can't happen if that's all it is. In fact, back in November, we sent out a survey to our Bridgepoint family. We just asked different questions like, hey, how often do you pray? Never, sometimes, often, always. How often are you reading your Bible? How important is church to you? Like all of these different things. And I think coming out of that survey, one of the things that we found is that there are more people who rate involvement at Bridgepoint higher as a higher priority than spiritual growth and development. And listen, there's various reasons for that. Some people say, well, I don't know how, or even worse, I don't have time. But man, my fear is that as a church, we would be great at producing Bridgepoint members. But when I stand before Jesus, we won't look like him. We have to it can't just be good teaching. We got to go further than that. And that's why I love being a part of a church that emphasizes community as much as we do. And I think we do a great job with that. But even with that, that's like a two-legged stool, right? It's not going to stand up very long. Well, as a church, the season we're going in this next direction is we have to incorporate these practices in our lives. And so I'm just going to tell you, for the next 8 weeks, we're going to be looking at 8 practices that Jesus did. And all we're trying to do is we just want to do what Jesus did. So just one a week. And you're going to be tempted. I said this last week. You're going to be tempted to try to do like all 8 of them. Like, please do not do that. That's not going to work. But as we're going through this series, I want you to come out with 2 things. All right, it's 2022. 2 things for 2022 that you would incorporate into your daily rhythm, and you would find people, that community, to hold you accountable for doing those. Do you think people overestimate what can happen in a year, and they underestimate what can happen in 5 years? So we think that if we just do all 8 of them in 1 year, then we'll make up all the ground. That's not what this life is about. And it's not even about this legalism and like, hey, we just need you to do more stuff to love God. That's not what this is about at all. This is something that has been practiced by Christians throughout the centuries. In fact, the word they have for it is a rule of life. Not rules for life, okay? It's not a Jordan Peterson book. It's a rule of life. And it comes from a Latin phrase. The word rule was regula, which actually means ruler. And the idea is that if a farmer was going to have these vines grow and produce fruit, they were going to put these rulers or this lattice in the ground to facilitate growth. I know you guys look like you're familiar with gardening and you spend a lot of time on the farm. So you probably, like, if you ever see a vine, anybody here ever been to a vineyard? Sorry for my Baptist friends. Anyone ever here been to a grape juice factory before? Like if you go, what you find is they have these posts and they'll have this line and they're trying to grow because a vine will grow, right? Growing the vine is not the problem. The vine will grow, but if it doesn't have that framework, it will grow on the ground. But then what happens to the fruit? The animals come and take it. It gets stepped on. Stuff cuts off branches, like there's wounding. And so what a farmer has to do is they put in these rulers, they put up this lattice to give structure so that when growth happens, it grows intentionally. And it grows up off the ground so that fruit can be produced, that injury doesn't occur. That is why these practices are important. Because guess what? In and of themselves, they don't change anything. Like I know people who know their Bible way better than I do, but they don't follow Jesus. And they're not trying to. They're just scholars who just love to study the Bible, but it doesn't necessarily mean you're looking like Jesus, but it is a framework that helps facilitate growth. Because you know, the Holy Spirit is the only one who can cause growth to happen. Like a farmer doesn't go out and like just yell at the plants until the fruit comes. Like, you idiot, I've been tending you for months. Like, come on. Like you can't make the vine grow fruit, but you can provide conditions that make fruit possible. By the way, Jesus uses this metaphor in John chapter 15. He's talking to some of his followers. In John chapter 15, verse 4, he says, "Remain in me and I in you. Just as a branch is unable to produce fruit by itself unless it remains on the vine, neither can you unless you remain in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. The one who remains in me and I in him produces much fruit because you can do nothing without me." Like if you want to produce fruit, you can't white knuckle it. You can't just make a resolution and go for it. The only way fruit happens is when you abide in Jesus, when you spend time with him. That's why we do 21 days of prayer. It's not because I love waking up early, because I don't. Like if I can be honest, like it's gonna be cold in the morning and my truck sits in the driveway and I don't have remote start. You know, my truck leaks oil all over the place. It's old. But I want to be here because guess what? When I abide in Jesus, I become more like him. Like when I spend time with him, I start to look like him. And when I put these practices into place, guess what? The things we do something to us. Because I have become one of those psychopaths that likes black coffee. I don't know if this is your experience. Like when I was in high school, I would go to like Starbucks. I'd be like, have them put like 28 different shots of raspberry and whatever in, because you got to kill the taste of the coffee. But then over time, you just start to, just take the sugar out a little bit. Just take the cream out a little bit. And then now I just wake up in the morning and I drink black coffee and I sit there and I think, man, like my kids want a sip of it. They're like, this is gross. Why do you drink it? I don't know, because these practices that I did, they did something to me. The more that I drink it, the more they learn, the more that I'm with Jesus. The more time I spend in silence and solitude. The more time I spend in his word and in prayer, I start to become like him. Listen, I don't have it figured out. This isn't like an 8-week series where at the end you look like Jesus. This is like, let's put some things in place because this is a lifelong journey. You jump down to verse 8. Jesus concludes this section. He says, "My Father is glorified by this, that you produce much fruit and prove to be my disciples." I don't love the way this translation says prove to be. It actually means just become. Like you just become a disciple. That's God's will for your life, that you would produce fruit. You know, students, what's God's will for my life? Does he want me to go to this school or that school? What career? His will is that you would produce fruit and be a disciple. Adults. Does God want me to date this person, take this job, move to this city? I think his will is that you would produce fruit and be his disciple. And so as we continue in worship this morning, we're going to continue the way we do every week with the time of communion so that we can be with Jesus. So we have 2 communion stations in the back, 2 on the sides. If you're watching online, grab, crackers and juice, bread and water, Doritos and Mountain Dew, whatever you got. Because in this time that we spend with Jesus, I want us to spend a moment just reflecting on 2 questions. The first one is this: who am I becoming? Notice it's not saying like, who do I want to become? Or what picture in my mind, who are you right now? Your life is perfectly designed to give you the results you are experiencing. So who are you becoming? Like, is it that intentional formation or is it more unintentional? Like, who are the people that you are around? Did you make specific decisions to be around those people, or is it just who you happen to be around? Is it practices that you're trying to put into place, or is it just habits that you've fallen back to for years? Is it really leaning into the teaching of Jesus, or just believing whatever media we're consuming? Who am I becoming? Because we can't move forward until we're honest about where we are now. And then the second question I want you to ask yourself is, who does Jesus want me to become? Are there areas in our life that he's calling us to lay down, to surrender? Are there practices he's calling us to take up? I think he's calling all of us to change. He wants to transform us, to change us, not just a better version of ourselves, but a completely new person. That's the call of Jesus. That's what he longs for today. So I'm going to pray for us, and then we'll head into our time of communion. Would you bow your heads and pray with me? Jesus, we're so thankful that you didn't just come to make us good people. You came to make us new people. I'm so thankful that you don't just try to put on all these things as a burden, but you've given us instructions on how we can actually be transformed. And so I pray that over the course of this series, Jesus, we wouldn't be burdened and think of this as rules we have to do, but you would just highlight just a couple of these that we could put into place because we just want to be more like you. Pray right now that your Spirit would move, that you would reveal to each of us who we're set up to become, and then reveal to us who you want us to become, and allow us to be formed in your image. It's in your name I pray. Amen. As you feel led, you can have communion. Also, on the communion tables, we have prayer cards, because again, tomorrow we start 21 days of prayer. So if there's anything you're praying to God for in this season, we'd love to partner with you in that. You can fill those prayer cards out, drop them in the black baskets at the back of the room, and we'll have those up here all throughout 21 days of prayer to pray with you, because I believe when we pray, God begins to move. Again, you can have communion as you feel led.